Hey everybody, happy 2026. It is January 2nd at time of recording, so it's a brand new year. And we're here to do number 88B in the Criterion collection because it's part 2 of Ivan the Terrible from Sergei Eisenstein from the Soviet Union, 1958. So 14 years after part 1. Some of that was due to World War II, some of that was due to a person that Eisenstein was working with being unavailable and him refusing to work until that person was available. This movie. It's even a little bit shorter than the first part. It is 80 minutes, but it is 80 minutes in which like 20 minutes of plot happen. It is a drag. It is slow. It I learned a little bit about Russian history that I didn't know because I'm a stupid American who doesn't know much about the history of other countries. So it's not without value. I'm sure it deserves its place. Especially what I find the most interesting about it is the history behind the making and release of it, which we'll get to in a minute. So this is Ivan the Terrible. He basically the first ruler of a unified Russia, which pissed off their boyars, but I want to call them like governors, who formerly held power, just like little fiefdoms. This is my understanding from these films. If I'm wrong, I apologize. But what I've gathered from the films is Russia was basically a series of little fiefdoms, each with their own ruler who had a council, and that's how they ruled Russia. Ivan was the first person who was like, nope, one person in charge of the whole shebang. And of course, people don't like losing power, so they were against him. Other countries, especially in this part, they make it very clear. Other countries were going to invade Russia, but first they needed not to have a strong unified leader in charge of Russia, so they were trying to undermine him and trick people into going back to the governor-controlled method so that then they could invade and chip away at Russia piece by piece instead of having to face a whole country. At the end of part 1, Ivan said, you know what? Nobody wants me? Fine. I'm going to go until the people ask me to come back. And just a ton of the citizenry marched and begged him to come back. And so part 2 is he comes back. He comes back and he deals with some of the boyars who are against him. That's the movie. That's it. There was initially planned to be a third part, which would have made more sense narratively. But there wasn't for a couple of reasons. First of all, Eisenstein, the director, died a year after this film was made. Second of all, nobody in Russia wanted this film to exist when they saw it. Now, if we're thinking about a trilogy, and I'm going to remove us a little bit from the actual factual historical story, and I'm just going to talk about the idea of a trilogy of films in this vein, right? So we're removing ourselves from Russia, but the idea of the first movie is the rise to power. The second movie is the leader possibly falling into bad tactics, being a bad person to consolidate his rule or letting power corrupt him, something like that. Yeah, so the first movie is rising action, then the second movie is a little bit of falling action, and then the third part would obviously be the redemption arc, where it all works out, he finds his path, everything is done for a good purpose and reason, done. That makes sense. That is a fairly normal structure, and that really looks like what this was leading to. The problem was a lot of Russian officials, I apologize for that beeping, I've got to figure out why my computer's been doing that recently. People in Russia did not like a less than positive portrayal of Ivan the Terrible. It's in the name. So a lot of people were like, you can't produce this. This is awful. I have an actual quote here that I think is super fun. Such a film about such a Russia, the Kremlin, could serve as fantastic agitation against us. Releasing this film will make people hate the government, essentially. They wanted the film to be 100% positive and to show that all of the choices that Ivan made were for good. Like, they had a positive net benefit, killing the people that he killed, getting revenge on the people against him was the right thing, which is what you would have gotten in a part 3, you dorks. Despite those opinions, the director insisted on screening it for Stalin, who is the one who had asked him to make this movie in the first place. And Stalin called it a nightmare. He said Ivan looked like a weak-willed Hamlet, compared his guard to the Ku Klux Klan, even though there was no racism in this film that I could see, which is primarily what I think of in the Klan. And so it was banned. The film was banned. So it came out years later. That's another reason why it was delayed so much, why it was delayed 14 years. Eventually, change of government, change of people, and they were like, yeah, people can totally see this. It's fine. It's historical. But by that point, the director was already dead. And I find the whole thing is fascinating because it's a common saying that history is written by the victors, right? Everything that we read in history books is the accounts of people who survived. You can't go and interview the people who died in a war and get their opinion. I mean, it's a popular expression. The stronger-willed write history. America, for example, being a cultural powerhouse in the world, gets to put its own spin on things and pervade public consciousness even in other countries. The worst kind of government, the worst kind of people, are the ones who will not let you talk about history accurately unless that history is only positive. Right? I mean, Ivan is probably a more extreme example, but there is no person on this planet who is purely good. I'm sure even Mother Teresa said something rude to somebody once, right? We are all a mix of angels and demons. Terry Pratchett described humanity as where the rising ape meets the falling angel, which is a good one. None of us are perfect, but when you don't allow history, documentaries, or dramatics, or textbooks to include the bad and the good, then you are hurting your ability to learn from history. Let's take Thomas Jefferson, right? Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence. Smart man, helped come up with some great guidelines for our new country. Was a slave owner. Now, at the time, the evil of that wasn't as widely considered. But if you make a film about Thomas Jefferson now, if somebody came along and was like, no, you can't mention that he owned slaves, that makes him look bad. No, it makes him look real. That's what happened. That's the point of discussing history, is to discuss what actually happened. So, as previously stated, I'm an American. Pretty obvious from my accent and probably my lack of knowledge of other countries. It is so easy. I have completely lost what I was about to say. In the history of international relationships, I am trying to be so careful here. Frequently in our history, Russia is painted to us as the bad guy. Now, I am not making any statements about the Russian people. I'm talking in generic terms here, all right? I'm not trying to start any fights or make any enemies. But generally, it is impressed upon us Americans that Russia is, heavily censors and controls its media and is, if not fascist, fascist adjacent in terms of controlling things and not allowing freedom of speech or protests and these sorts of things. And that's exactly what this is. This is the worst thing you can see come from a government is you can't say that because even if it's true, it'll make us look bad. And here in America, we're not immune from it either. I'm not going to dive into current politics, but you're welcome to draw some conjectures because I feel like they're there. I will give an example from my own life that I've experienced when I was in middle school. I had a teacher who was very adamant when talking about the Civil War, which is the American Civil War. I'm trying to remember, it's international. Anybody can watch this. The American Civil War. It's generally understood that the American Civil War, the inflection point was slavery. The southern states wanted to keep their slaves because their economy was built on it. That's being generous. We're leaving out the idea that maybe they just saw them as subhuman. Their economy was built on the idea of slavery. Getting rid of slavery would have fundamentally altered their economy, and so they said no. And the federal government said yes, and then the South said, then we quit. That's essentially what the Civil War... Now, were there other issues? Probably, certainly, but that was the big one. And when I was in middle school, my teacher was adamant that the Civil War was not because of slavery. It was because of states' rights. You're going to hear it was about slavery. It wasn't about slavery. It wasn't because of slavery. It was because of states' rights. And refused to talk about the slavery angle of it. And that's the exact same thing. And there's more and more of that. That was in the 90s that happened to me. And it's gotten worse since then. And it's the exact same thing that Russia did to this film. And considering how frequently we paint this kind of behavior from Russians as, look at how terrible they are. We are guilty of the exact same thing. I'm sure every culture is. I find it deplorable. Censorship is just bad. There's an argument to be made for some extreme representations, extreme gore or extreme sexual acts. Maybe we want to try and shield more sensitive people from it, shield children from that sort of thing. Sure. But by and large, the idea of censoring something because it'll make you look bad is not a good reason to do it. Anyway. So like I said, the movie itself, my God, drained the life out of me, just like the first part. But I do find the history behind it fascinating because clearly, as somebody who watches film, clearly as somebody who is media literate, I like to think, it's very clear that this second act was building up to a third act, which would have been the redemption of all of his acts. But the people who wanted this movie made, apart from the director who actually made it, the government that wanted this made didn't understand that, didn't want to understand it, and didn't care. No patience, no vision, just no, banned. It's a lot to think about. And doing this review without a script or anything, just kind of spitting out the thoughts in my head, which is what I've done for most of these, might be doing a disservice to my points here. But please take what I've been saying and just think about it. Because there's not much us as individuals can do against government censorship. But governments don't last forever. They change, they evolve, and eventually new people come into power. And so by talking about things like this, by opening hearts and minds, you open up the possibility of things getting better in time. Right? You don't have to storm your country's capital and demand change. You just have to be able to talk about it. You have to be able to share new ideas with each other and be open to hearing new ideas. And when you encounter something you don't like, don't just shut it down. Consider it. You're still going to encounter things that are wrong and need to be shut down. Of course, because there's always going to be idiots. But just because you don't like something doesn't mean you shouldn't think about it for a minute. That's it. Actions can do good or ill. Thought can't hurt. Anyway, that's just my opinion. And I've gotten too deep on talking about just a piece of Russian history. Anyway, starting the new year. Next time. Oh, I guess, should you watch this? Man, I gotta tell you, these things are a slog. It's up to you. There's some interesting. The last 20 to 25 minutes of this actually becomes color and becomes mostly a dance sequence, and it's just like nightmare fuel. Everything is slow and drawn out. I don't recommend watching it. I'm sure there are people out there who want to watch it, and for film historians, there is value to it, especially the history behind it. So I'm not telling you not to watch it, but if you're gonna enjoy it, you got to be a particular sort of person, and that person ain't me. Anyway, number 89. Next time, we will talk about Sisters from director Brian De Palma from the United States from 1973. As always, thank you for being a part of this experiment. Thank you for putting up with my rambling today about government censorship. I will see you next time. I hope you have a great 2026.